Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Um, our topic today is anger, and thank God for grunge, because it's kind of hard to find. I grew up in the grunge era, right? It's kind of hard, grunge, punk, like it's kind of hard to find songs that are dedicated to anger. That's not what people get on the radio, but Alice in Chains sure did, and so thank God for the grunge era. Okay, our topic is anger today. You will not be surprised, I think, if I suggest to you that Moses was a grumpy guy, right? Like that's not shocking if we start to think about Moses's character, this Moses, our leader, the ultimate prophet, the great channel through which the Torah comes. If we start to say, like, who was this guy? What was he like? I'm sure, you know, within 5 adjectives, we'd have something like moody, stormy, and even angry. He was an angry prophet, and prophets tend to be angry, and that's already something that we might want to think about. Jeremiah was angry all the time, right? Hosea was angry. Why are the prophets angry? It's a big topic actually in our tradition, anger, right? The Old Testament, as those in other traditions call it, will sometimes point to the anger, the severity, the harshness of the Torah, of the stories in the Torah, of the God of the Torah, right? So it's actually quite a big topic. But Moses in particular, he's an angry guy, and one might even say he's got a problem. And this week we're going to see that problem start to bubble up. We're going to see our tradition start to take notice and wonder whether Moses has got something he's got to work on. Okay, so we're gonna look at the case of Moses's anger, and through that begin to think about the big topic of anger in our tradition and in our sacred text. Okay, and I guess I will also say I am an angry guy. I get angry. Like it's a character flaw of mine that I'm always struggling with. So I'll at least, maybe there's others of you out there. Like this is a big topic, not just because there it is and what is that human emotion from a distance, but because a lot of us experience it, daily, maybe on the road, maybe in conversations, maybe, right? It's something I know I work on as we head towards Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. It's like, oh, that seems like it's always one of the topics for me. So I want to say it's personal also, and maybe it is for some of you as well. So as we work on Moses, we'll also be working on ourselves. Okay, let's make a blessing and move from Alice in Chains into the Torah. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank God for this space. Okay, so let's take a look. Here's a source sheet for today, and the thing that we're going to notice right away, the thing that we pay a lot of attention to in this class, and that we should pay a lot of attention to when we read the Torah, we're going to notice an unusual word. Right? You notice a very specific word for anger, and we're going to start paying attention to that word, because there are a lot of words for anger, but this is an unusual one. Okay, so let's begin. Where are we? We are in the last 2 Parshot of the Torah, or together the last Parsha of the Torah, Matot-Masei, and one of the first things that we hear about there's a section on vows, and then I must say, these last Parshot are difficult because it seems like a catalog of we should say this, we should give these laws, we should map out the boundaries of the land. the book of Numbers started with details and it seems to end in details, but there are some moments of narrative kind of interspersed, and one of them is in response to early on in this week's reading. There's a command. God gives Moshe a command to tzror et Midyanim, to attack the Midianites. Attack the Midianites. And Midian is a huge region full of enemy nations, sort of to the east, southeast of the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And we're to attack the Midianites. And presumably the reason to attack the Midianites that is most fresh in our ears is that the Midianites, and specifically the Moabites, have been trying to undermine the people of Israel as Israel comes in. We know that the king of Moab was very freaked out and tried to get the prophet Bilam to curse Israel. And then after that, there's this scene of just sort of mass orgy, essentially. And I mean that in all the ways. In other words, there are Moabite women seducing the men of Israel and then seducing them to worship their God. So there's like sexuality and idolatry in some mass frenzy, and God responds with a plague. God gets angry. Okay, so we're already talking about that. God gets angry, responds with a plague, and Pinchas, the priest, comes in and attacks one of the Israelites who's cavorting with a Moabite woman and stops the plague through that. That's a story. It's a classic story. It's a story we read about in last week's Torah portion, Parshat Pinchas. Okay, so that's that. The Midianites, they almost got us. They almost ruined us. It was really our fault, right? But they are trying to get us, and we really have to defeat them. And God says now, Surah to Midianim, defeat the Midianites, and they go out and they defeat the Midianites, and they bring back the spoils of war. And listen to them coming back and Moses's response when he hears how the battle went. Okay, and this is it. Vayiksof Moshe. Vayiksof Moshe. That's the word that we're going to be looking at. Vayiksof Moshe. Moses became angry. Okay, that's one of the words that we're going to use for anger. That's one of the words that we have for anger. Initially, I just wanted to show you that this is a word for anger, Vayiksof Moshe. But right away, I want to give it a very specific quality, and I'm gonna use the word enraged. Okay, and the reason I'm going to use the word enraged, let me finish I haven't even made it through the first sentence. Let me finish this section. Moses became enraged with the commanders of the army, the officers of the thousands, and the officers of the hundreds who had come back from the military campaign. Okay, Moses is enraged, furious, and then Unusual bursts into anger, and that's unsettling. Why has Moses lost his temper when they seem to have been successful? Well, the reason is even more disturbing than the fact of the anger itself. Moses said to them, "You've spared all of the women. You spared every female. Yet they are the very ones who, at the bidding of Bilam the prophet, really seduced the Israelites to trespass against the Eternal in the matter of Peor," that's their god, Baal Peor, "so that the plague struck the congregation of the Eternal." Okay. So Moses is like, "You let the women live? Are you kidding me? You're supposed to kill everybody. The women weren't innocent. The women were the problem. You should have killed all the women." So Moses is raging, and his rage is because we were too merciful. Apparently they had attended to some kind of standard of laws of war, no women and children kind of thing. And Moses says, "No, kill them all." And he's enraged. And it's a very specific word, and I want to translate it as rage. And we'll just do a little etymological work here. There are lots of words for anger in the Torah. Probably the most common is lecharot af. That is to be flaring of the nostrils, literally, is the idiom. But that's the one v'yichar af. That's the one we see most commonly associated with God and other characters. Vayichar, that's very common. I don't know what the verb vayichar, lecharot or lachrot. I'm not sure which one, but to flare. And then there's ka'as, just the standard word we use for anger. There's za'am, which is like stormy anger, rogez, fury, litragez. But this one is liktsof. And some of you may, if you speak Hebrew, modern Hebrew, you may know the word, what is liktsof? You may know the word ketzef. Do you know the word ketzef? What is ketzef? Anyone nodding out there? Ketzef is, Yael knows. Yael?
Foam.
Foam. Beautiful. Exactly.
He got foamed up.
On your what?
He got foamed up or stirred up.
That's right. And frothing with rage is the way I would translate it. That I think is very frothing over, like foaming at the mouth. That's the kind of anger that we're talking about here. Whipped cream in modern Hebrew is katsefet, right? Foaming at the mouth. Foaming at the mouth. Okay. So he's like so angry because you didn't kill these women who almost ruined everything. Moses is so angry. And Rashi notices that. Rashi notices, wait, this is a problem. This is a little too much. But Rashi doesn't say anything at first. Rashi enters the conversation in a very interesting way. Just a few verses later, so Moses got so enraged by Yiktsof Moshe, and a few verses, this is 14 through 16, and then in verse 21 we read, Eleazar the priest said to the troops who had taken part in the fighting, this is, and he gives them some instructions, the laws, you collected all of these like gold and silver and copper items, but you have to purge them of impurity. They have to be kosher. This is, in fact, one of the sources we use for the idea of koshering, of making kosher vessels. So Eleazar the priest says, this is what you do, and this is what God commanded Moses. For gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, and lead, any article that can withstand fire, these you shall pass through fire, and they should be pure, except that then after you have to put water on it, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so the basic idea is you collected these like metal objects, but you have to just purify them with fire. Okay, why am I bringing you here? What's unusual about this moment? About this? If you're Rashi or you're one of our commentators and you want to say, wait, that's odd, Richard, ask to unmute.
Doesn't it sound like sacrifices to Baal? There's a whole passage in the Torah about bringing children through the fire. The parents are not to put children through the fire.
That's interesting.
Reminded me of those sacrifices.
That is an interesting comparison, like the way that fire purges and fire's associated with idolatry. It both is, okay, so there's something there, but that's too far afield for us right now. I want something simpler. What is like strange about this moment where Eleazar is teaching the people? Lawrence Zuckerman.
Thanks, Larry. In other cases, God said there's certain parts of the booty that belong to me, and this one, it's like take all you want. And that
okay, so there's no donation. Okay, you know what? This group's already too nuanced for me. I'm looking for something. This is good. These are good answers. I like, as soon as you start to say it, I think, oh, that is interesting. We go down that route, but I guess I'll just give the answer that I'm fishing for here, really, which is that Eleazar is doing the talking. Eleazar is instructing the people on the laws that God commanded Moses. Who is Eleazar? Eleazar is Aaron's son. Aaron's dead now, so Eleazar is the high priest. So on the one hand, great, he's the high priest. So he's going to say things. But on the other hand, even when Aaron was high priest, Aaron doesn't do the commanding. Moses does the commanding. Okay? So Moses is not talking here, and Rashi suddenly sees his opportunity and jumps in and makes a connection. What's going on with Moshe? So let's take a look. What Rashi says. This is an important Rashi. This Rashi will sort of shape the rest of our conversation. So Rashi says, Eleazar the priest said, why didn't Moses say? Lefi sheba Moshe lichlal kas, ba lichlal ta'ut. Okay, this is a principle. Because Moses became enraged, in this case, actually, I'm going to change, became angry, right? Because Rashi uses the more standard word. Because Moses became angry, he began making mistakes. Ta'ut is mistake. And he forgot all of the laws of purging foreign vessels. Okay? And like, this is like a very, very deep, very quick, deep psychological cut here. Moses was so angry, he began to forget Torah. God had told him this, but he couldn't remember it. Now that's a serious thing to say about the great prophet of Israel. Not only that he has an anger problem, but and that it gets out of control, but that it causes him to screw up his most central and the most central task in our story, which is his role in delivering the word of God. He cannot do that because he's too angry. Okay, so I want us to think about what the connection is between anger and this sort of forgetfulness, this sort of lapse in consciousness. I want us to think about that. And so I'm going to open it up soon. But before I do, I want to just show us the rest of this Rashi, because Rashi gives us, that's an interesting connection he made, right? He saw that Moses got angry, and then he saw somebody else was instructing. Aha! So Moses must have forgotten the laws. Okay, that's kind of a neat connection. How do you know that's true? But actually, Rashi comes in and he gives us a couple of other examples, because it turns out we've seen Moses katsaf, Moses become frothing over with rage. We've seen that happen before. So let's see what Rashi adds. You see this also happened on the day of inaugurating the Mishkan, the tabernacle. As it is said, and it did say back there in Leviticus, and Moses was enraged with Eleazar and Itamar, two of Aaron's sons. He became angry and then began making mistakes. Now, do you need to know the backstory here? Not really, but just in case you want to know the backstory, here it is in Leviticus. Moses is angry. Why? Because they offered a sacrifice and they didn't, the laws, you're supposed to eat part of the sacrifice, the priests eat part of the sacrifice in the sanctuary. And they didn't do it. And you didn't follow the laws. You didn't eat part of the sacrifice. I already told you have to do that. And this is inauguration day. And meanwhile, this all is the moment after Aaron's two other sons have just died. And so Aaron responds to Moses, this is the day that they brought their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Eternal, meaning my other sons. And such things have befallen me. I've just experienced tremendous loss. If I had rejoiced in eating the offering, if I had eaten the sin offering today, would God really have wanted that? I'm in a state of despair. You really think that I should be enjoying the bloody meat of the sacrifices? Don't you think that my mourning counts for something? Okay, so that's the backstory. Again, you don't need to keep track of that, but it is an example of just how insensitive Moses was. He's enraged with these two boys who just lost their older brother. Right? He's enraged with Aaron, who just lost his sons because they didn't follow the law. And then as soon as Aaron responds, Moses says, oh, you're right. You're right. That doesn't make any sense. I shouldn't be asking you to do something so surely God understands. What am I thinking here? Right? So Moses, Rashi now has spotted a pattern for us. And the pattern is Moses loses it, and then he loses information. Right? He loses his mind a little bit, and he can't focus anymore. And there's something about Moses that, like, we keep seeing this happen. Okay. And then Rashi gives one more example, and this is interesting because so far Rashi's been paying attention to this unusual word, and Rashi noticed we saw it once before, and then Rashi throws in a third example, but in the third example we don't actually have that word. So that's interesting. Rashi just gives us another example, but actually it is the most classic example. The example is, and so too, when Moses said, Shimuna Hamorim, listen, you rebels, and Moses, he smote. Let's change that. And he struck the rock. And it's through his anger that he made the mistake. So this makes sense in one way because it's the same pattern. He gets angry and then he screws up. And this is the punishment for which this is the sin for which Moses was punished with not being able to enter the land of Israel. So it's very serious. It is maybe the ultimate example of Moses losing his cool. But it's interesting that Rashi throws that in because it doesn't have that word that we've been tracking. Okay? So in other words, the word is an alert to us that Moses's anger is frothing over. But Rashi says, but you know what? We can just see this in Moshe in general, that Moshe is the kind of person who flies into rage and then forgets things. Okay. All right. So I want to think with you a little bit about that. There's a bit of rabbinic psychology there. That when Moses gets angry, he begins to make mistakes, terrible mistakes, some insensitive, look at all these moments. You should have killed the women, you should have eaten the food right after your sons died, right? And then the moment of rage that actually loses him his entry into the land of Israel, Moses is doing these really egregious, not just making little mistakes, but really we're seeing a side of him we don't want to see. So what is that all about? What is the connection between anger and forgetfulness and a kind of an occlusion of consciousness? And I know that's a very difficult question to answer. So let me throw one more thing into the mix, and then I'm going to turn to the group. It isn't actually surprising that Rashi is critiquing anger because the rabbis in general were very, very suspicious of anger. Anger was something that if the Torah is full of it, the rabbis seem to be backing away from it. They don't like anger. And here is one of the most famous rabbinic statements of the problem with anger. And it's put in very stark terms. So I'm going to give you this, and then I'm going to open up the conversation so that we can think about what their philosophy of anger is. What is the rabbinic philosophy of anger? But here's a really, really strong statement. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Chilfa bar Agra, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and here's the statement. Anyone who rips his clothes in anger or breaks vessels in anger, people throw things around the house, or throws his money into the air in anger. This is like a movie scene. Here, take it. Throwing the $100 bills at you. You should regard them as if they had committed idolatry. For this is the practice of the evil instinct, the Yetzer Hara. This is what the evil urge inside of us does. Today, it should really be, it tells someone to go and do this, and tomorrow it says, go and do that. It's commanding you to do these things, and then one day it says, go worship idols. And that person goes and worships. Okay, that's also a little confusing, but there's some suggestion there. Anger is like idolatry because both of them are just the evil urge inside of you and you're just following that urge. You're following that urge. Okay. So now we've got a couple of very interesting statements from the rabbis about what anger does. It causes you to forget things. It causes you to become a monstrous person. It causes you to become an idolater, the worst thing that this tradition can say you are. So what do you think? What are they saying there about anger? Let's turn that over. Let's analyze that a little bit. Alex Weiss.
Yeah, I think this connection to forgetfulness, I think inherently comes from this imagery of anger as being like a fire. Where speaking of vessels, the way that you can permanently purify a vessel is through fire. So that's a fun connection there. But really, like a fire can be all-consuming and get out of control, it's not a particularly agile emotion, unless if something gets poured onto the fire that extinguishes it. I think of when Aaron responds to Moshe. And then he realizes that he's not exactly being particularly sensitive to the situation. I think of any time that I've been angry. It takes realizing how out of control I'm being to kind of snap me back into it. Whereas with other emotions, you can be a lot more dynamic, but really this all-consuming nature consumes really everything else. When you kind of, when you're seeing red, you get this tunnel vision where everything else just gets consumed until something kind of snaps you out of it.
Okay, I appreciate all of those very vivid descriptions of this state of being. So let me respond in two. I just want to amplify two implications of what you're saying. Alex compares anger to a fire, and I think that's right. It was right because it's right to begin thinking about the physical descriptions of anger that the Torah seems to be working with here, right? Because we're dealing with ketzef, right? Foam, frothing at the mouth. So the Torah wants us to think physically about like bubbling over, right? Vayichar, the most common, vayichar af, the flaring of the nostrils, like there's a lot of these descriptions of anger seem to be taking over your body. They are manifesting in you in a way that it is out of your control. And as Alex framed it again and again, it's this force that's out of control. And the other thing that I want to just like tease out of Alex's framing there is that, if anger is a fire, then we might notice the way that God gets angry in the Torah and fire breaks out. That happens. So fire is one of, it's like a literal metaphor, like when God breaks out in rage, something breaks out in the world. There are physical manifestations of anger in us, and as we witness the rage of God, often what we're talking about is the raging fire or the raging plague or the raging, right? We even saw that God got angry at because of the idolatry at Moab, and a plague breaks out. Okay, so there's like physical descriptions. So all of that is very, very, very helpful. Okay, let's see. Larry Zuckerman, but Larry's seatmate.
Hi,
The better half.
I'm Laura Zuckerman. Nice
Laura.
to see you, and thank you. This is really edifying. And so I was going to ask if when we talk about a strong emotion, we sometimes say our judgment is clouded. And then I would go further and say clouded by what? And usually that has to do with our ego. This has to do with us and not God. So we replace one for the other, which is a form of idolatry, except the graven image is mine.
Beautiful and profound, and also very precise. Very that you really put that in very quick phrasing there. There is something about anger. I think you're tapping right into the rabbinic theory of anger here. There's something about anger that is idolatrous because you're serving yourself. You're upset about something. You didn't get something. You want something to be a certain way, and you're following that, right? Your God is now you or your feeling. or like this uncontrollable force that's within you is grounded in your own sense of the way things ought to be, and that's your God now, right? So that's a very startling kind of kind of theological critique of anger. But I think Laura's tapping right into it. Susan Schlesinger.
It seems that the rabbis are putting this on a very high level in the hierarchy of sins, because there are only a few things, if I remember right, you can't do to save a life, one of which is idolatry. And here they're comparing anger to idolatry, which would therefore place it as a great sin, not just a minor slip.
That's right. And those are the stakes here. I mean, Susan reminds us that when we say that Moshe became so angry that he began to forget things. I mean, like somewhere in this conversation, we might have an exercise in distinguishing between healthier and less healthy forms of anger. We're familiar with the phrase righteous indignation in our times. That seems to bespeak a good kind of, outrage. Certainly in our community, like there's certain kinds of outrage that we almost like lean into, right? Political outrage. But Moshe is definitely in some other zone. He's in just rage, not outrage, but just pure rage. And that's never pretty. We never like seeing someone in that state. It's never a good look. And the rabbis are saying, no, it's more than not a good look. Like there's something evil about it. It's as bad, it's idolatrous. And to say that about Moshe, what does that mean to say that Moshe was acting like an idolater? To say that Moshe was forgetting the laws means cut off from God, right? So there's a parallel there. He's cut off from God, and that's what Moshe is. He's the channel to God. David Kurtz.
Sorry, can you hear me? Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to be a little more generous. I recognize this anger as I see the generation ahead of me. As they get older, they get angrier. Here we are. Everybody except I think Joshua and Caleb are gone. His brother and sister are gone. He doesn't know these people, and he's frustrated. It's an anger that comes from the frustration of kind of growing old, thinking you know better. It's extremely recognizable to me. And I forgot my other point. That's it.
That's a good enough point. I mean, that is really important here. And thank you for giving us a little, like we all we always have to have a little compassion for Moshe, right? We can't just, I mean, the guy had the hardest job, and it's unfathomable, and he didn't want it. Right? It's a terrible, terrible job. And who else gets angry all the time? Is God gets angry at the people. And Moshe is always negotiating that. Sometimes he's defending God against the people. Sometimes he's defending the people against God. It's like, so he loses it himself. Sometimes they're 40 years in the desert. And as David points out, and now they're at the end of it. It's like poor guy. Yeah, he lost his cool a little bit. Can't we understand? Okay, so let's humanize, let's place into context. Let's think about the ways that we get angry, right? Like, are we really idolaters? Is this really, how serious is this really? Okay, so that's good. That's a good counterbalance. All right, let's take a couple more reflections. And then I want to push us forward a little bit. Payam?
Yeah, I want to stand up for Moses. I think Moses's anger is very different than our anger. Our anger is illogical. Like, we don't know the consequences of, the actions, or why we get mad at anybody, or, we put ourselves in, we lose our humility, etc. But Moses' anger is logical. I mean, he's a prophet. He knows exactly what's going to happen to these people. God's going to unleash another plague on them. He's going to kill them. I mean, so I don't see how you can say his anger is bad. I think it would be much worse if he was just apathetic. His anger is logical. It's radically different than our anger.
Good. I like the way you're putting it, Payam, and that's it is a kind of a third perspective, right? Like, poor Moshe, he's losing his cool, is one perspective. David helps us to appreciate what is Moshe doing. He's like crossing the line is another perspective that maybe Rashi is pushing us towards. But Payam says, well, he uses the word logical. I'm not sure if I would use the word logical, but I know what Payam means, which is that Moshe gets it. You know, Moshe sees the truth. He sees he talks to God. He knows what the rules are, what the destiny is, what the force operative above. People don't understand, and they're just like complaining about food, and no, they don't want to follow these laws, and the simplest things, you know, just not to like beg to go back to Egypt. Maybe just like don't, you know, after God saves all of your entire people in a great, tremendous revelation of glory and all, you're like, maybe just, you know, stop being so like pathetic. Moshe sees there's something about his perspective that's different, and it's got to be frustrating to have to get people to just, you know, it's like I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but it's a little bit like climate change, you know? It's like the Moshe knows that you got to change everything, and he just can't see why the people won't just like change all their behavior immediately. But the people don't get it. There's something like there's a gap in knowledge there, where it's just, if you just knew the truth, just do what I say, you know? Okay. All right. Let's take one more comment from Jen, and then I want to show us. I want to do a little more investigation into anger in our Torah. Jen.
Okay, I am a big defender of anger because professionally, I have to undo so much damage that has been done to people, especially marginalized people, by asking them to think of their anger as inherently bad or problematic, right? But what I see is like a real double standard that we have, where people in power or people who have social kinds of power, their anger is often overlooked or excused or justified. The anger of people who are not in power, very often we get like anger isn't good for you and you need to forgive. And there is a huge disjunction in our cultural discourse about anger. And I just want to point out that we're talking about how like Moses, you know, sometimes it makes sense that he gets angry, but right now he's angry because people didn't slaughter an entire community full of women. And I don't think we can ignore the fact that Moses's anger is deadly. It is dangerous and deadly for everyone. And the reason why his anger is problematic is because he's not paying attention to the way that it intersects with his power. And that's a very different kind of anger than, say, if the Moabite women were super angry, which they would deserve to be.
Okay, good. I'm so glad. I'm so grateful for your perspective, Jenna, sort of counting on it. First of all, for some of that distinguishing between like forms of anger, healthy expressions of anger, are we really suggesting that we ought to mute anger entirely? It does sometimes sound like that in our tradition. And so one wonders how to put that's like that ethic in dialogue with with what Jen's talking about, the kind of allowance for people to really express the pain and the anger that's born of pain. So that's an important and complex conversation to have, or at least to include in this one. But then Jen also starts talking about power dynamics and what is different about someone raging from a position of power, and how we treat anger, how we expect to see anger from the highest sources, how we treat it, how it might differently affect the way people feel empowered to express their anger. Okay, this is a very important point, and it leads us perfectly into the next texts that I want us to see, because for me, as a kind of I said at the outset, as a follower of words, we got to pay attention to the words in the Torah. The Torah expresses herself through words and word play. And so when you see an unusual word like liktsof, to froth over with rage, you know, Rashi notices Moses get there twice. Okay, who else in the Torah froths over with rage? Other people get angry, but only one other person in the Torah is angry the way Moses is angry, vayiktsov, and he got enraged. Who's the one other person in the Torah that got that enraged? I see people mouthing it. Pharaoh.
Wow.
Pharaoh is the other person in the Torah. So let's just take a look at that. So Pharaoh, same language here, vayiktsov. Just even visually look up at Moses, vayiktsov. Okay, so Moses and Pharaoh are the only two people in the Torah that get angry in this way. And Pharaoh became enraged with his two, servants, courtiers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody and in the house of the prefect in the same prison house where Joseph was confined. Because he can do anything. And he lost his temper. We're not even sure why, but he lost his temper and he threw two people into prison. So that's anger expressed from the highest levels of power, when you can do anything you want, and you better not anger the dictator, right? Okay, so that's important to note. We've got Moshe expressing ketzef, this frothing rage, and we got Pharaoh expressing ketzef, this frothing rage. And, that I think plays very nicely into Jen's analysis there, and thinking about, the leader of Israel and the leader of Egypt, these are the people we see get to this point of ketzef. So what does that mean? We see other people get angry, but not ketzef. Okay. We are coming to the last quarter of our hour. And so I want to just hustle us along a little further, because as we sit and notice that Moses reaches this level of anger, and I said there's only one other person in the Torah who reaches that level of anger, and it's Pharaoh, right? And that's true, but there is one other figure in the Torah that reaches that level of anger, right? Not person, but figure in the Torah, right? And you're starting to nod, and that's God. And that's God. The three figures in the Torah that really get to the level of ketzef are Moses, Pharaoh, and let's see some examples of God being described in this language. So here is anger management case 3. So they fell on their faces, Moses and Aaron. This is during the rebellion of Korach, and they said, "Oh God of the spirits of all flesh, will you become enraged?" Now, that's actually a question, so it's not yet descriptive. But by Deuteronomy, Moses is saying, "The Eternal heard the sound of your complaint, vayiktsov, and became enraged. I was in dread of the Eternal's anger and fury when God was enraged, katsaf, with you and sought to wipe you out." Right, and so forth. Okay, so that's something that, now let's pause again and just play with that dynamic a little bit. What does it mean that we only see this level of like ketzef, rage, with Moses, Pharaoh, and God? Right? These like three kind of big alphas in the Torah, right? All right, Matt, what do you think?
Okay. The Torah is sometimes confused as to whether or not Moses is a god. He takes on, so it to me, it makes absolute sense that Moses, Pharaoh, who is a god, and God, who is the God, all get this attribute. I think it is a totally, completely consistent position. And I think it probably actually connects to Jen's, except for Jen gave a complaint, and I don't think the Torah is complaining, that they have the right to it. They have the power. They are allowed to do it because they are the powerful ones. And while anger is bad, it is also an expression of power. And
okay, that's a really beautiful analysis Matt gives us there. That's a really beautiful analysis, because Matt is saying, that's right. Yes, agreed to Jen on one point, which is that this is a particular kind of anger that is the expression of the most powerful. And yeah, it's frothing over because that's part of the point. You better watch out when someone that powerful gets angry. Their anger is like a manifestation of some mighty and terrible force in the world, right? And then the question is, okay, but is it a critique? And Matt says here, he parts with Jen and says, no, the Torah seems to be saying, I'm not sure Jen would disagree, but this is Matt's addition. The Torah seems to be saying that, like, no, God can get that angry, as can Moses, and, you know, I guess Pharaoh for that matter, anyone who's really in charge, who's like a god among men, a deity on earth. That figure can tap into the divine rage, and the divine rage is like, I think according to Matt, the Torah's perspective is like, yeah, better watch out. God's angry. That's like, you know, it's like, you better watch out for a forest fire. It's just the way it is, you know? So that's an interesting perspective. Agnes?
I feel like I really love Jen's point. It's well taken. I'm sort of folding it into my thinking here. It feels like I'm fixated on the way Rashi talks about anger, ba lichlal ka'as, and my like middling Hebrew makes me think that literally is almost like comes to a habit of anger, like where the general state is one of anger. It's different from like getting angry in one moment. It's like your trigger is just so light that you sort of, something happens and all of a sudden you interpret it. And I think it happens interpersonally, where you're in a bad relationship with somebody and everything they do seems like outrageous and you rush to an interpretation of it as in the worst possible way. And I feel like it's almost like a shortening of that space of interpretation of somebody else's actions. And it feels like that image of Yitzhak of bubbling over fits with that, because it's like when the water level is super high in the vessel, it's easy for it to overflow. Whereas if the water level is high, there's room for it to grow. And it feels like there's something in those moments when God gets angry, the way God cools down is by negotiating and talking and reinterpreting the situation. So it feels like, I don't know, it feels like there's something about that. What is it? It's not just about being angry, it's about being in a habit of anger where your interpretive trigger is really light and you jump to an interpretation of somebody else's actions that comes from just being worn down and not having the energy to like see all the possible paths of understanding what somebody else has done.
Yeah. Thanks. That's helpful. Agnes brings us back to and rightly brings us back to that Rashi that first got us thinking, because Rashi is describing. I think Agnes is right to remind us even of the language that Rashi uses. I translated it as he became angry, but literally it's Moses comes into the general state, the kind of a klal is like a general state of anger. And in that state, like it's totalizing, it's klal. So it's not like you lost your temper, but it's like you entered into another all-consuming domain. And it's just, you're now in a different state, a different reality. And then, you know, we can begin to think, what's different in that state? The synapses are firing too quickly. The container can't hold. Everything is bubbling up too hot in there, right? So, great. Marlene.
In the three examples of Pharaoh and God and Moses, it's only said about Moses that his anger is leading him to make mistakes. So I'm wondering if I'm not sure what that means, but it seems like it's a humanizing of him. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in an extremely angry household with an extremely angry father 24/7, and nobody could cut into telling him that he was making horrible mistakes by doing this. So I'm interested in the sort of human aspect of how do we interrupt the anger? How do we interrupt the making of mistakes? And God, who told Moses that he was going to be making these mistakes?
Yeah.
And what do we do with that as humans?
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Marlene. Yeah, it sounds like scary stuff. That is a really interesting way of thinking about this problem that we've been kind of turning over all along, was what is it about this state of anger that is so over the top that, first of all, you start to make mistakes, But secondly, like you've crossed the line into something that the rabbis call idolatrous, like you're following some other force, some other God. And I think those two concepts are related as Marlene expresses them. It's like, I'm no longer capable of making a mistake. I'm not even checking myself. I'm beyond question, right? When I'm in my rage, it's not like, I'm angry about this. Well, here's a counterpoint. Oh, thanks for telling me that. I'm listening to, you're not listening to anyone. And there's it's again, you're being in this all-consuming state. You're in this all-consuming state. And there's no room for error because it's all about how right you are. And in that state, of course, you're making tons of errors because you aren't God, you're human, right? Okay, all right. I want to point one last thing out before we close, because I noticed something that I think is worth reflecting on a little bit, right? We have three cases of anger, of rage, of frothing rage here. We have Moses, who's gotten frothing angry at least a couple of times, and certainly angry enough to really do damage more times than that in the Torah. We have Pharaoh, who got angry and threw two men into prison. And by the way, that also is a mistake. He later pulls one of them out. So he made a mistake about that. And then we've got God, who's described as with the same language. But take a look at all of the descriptions of God flying into a rage. See if you notice something that all of these descriptions have in common. All right. Again, Moses becomes angry, Pharaoh becomes angry. Now God, first of all, here's Aaron and Moses just asking, will you become enraged? Then Moses tells the people that the Eternal heard the sound of your complaint and became enraged. Then Moses says, I was in dread of the Eternal's anger and fury when God was enraged and sought to wipe you out. Remember and do not forget how you enraged the Eternal, your God, in the wilderness from the day you went out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place. So what do all those descriptions of God's rage have in common? They're all Moses's description of God. You understand what I'm saying? It's important. It's like it's a subtle difference because it's a difference in narration, but it's an important one. If we look at the description of Moses becoming angry, it's like the narrative voice of the Torah just says Moses became angry. That's where we started, right? Moses became angry. That's the objective voice of the Torah, so to speak. But in all of the descriptions of God becoming angry in this way, it's all Moses's voice. It's different, right? Pharaoh, again, the Torah says Pharaoh becomes enraged. But when it comes to God, it's always Moses that is using the language of frothing rage to describe God's anger. Now, don't get me wrong, God gets angry a lot in the Torah, but it's always a different word that's used to describe God's anger. The language that we've been tracking, this frothing rage, it is used to describe God, but only by Moshe. Now, what do you make of that? What do you make of that? All right, I see Ariella and Leah have hands up. Either of you have a thought on this?
Yeah, well,
Ariella, please.
my thought is, since Moshe is the one interacting with God, Moshe is the one recounting God's anger. And in some ways, Moshe recounts God's anger as to tell the people, you better watch it. Look how frothy God can get. It's
Okay.
kind of a way of keeping the people in line.
Okay, good. So one, we see Moses describing God as frothing with rage again and again and again. And one way of reading that is that Moses sees God. Moses knows God's rage in a way that nobody else, and Moses is the one that has to go before God. So Moses is just reporting, God gets this angry too. right? This thing that you've seen me bubble up into, the ultimate version of that is God, right? Okay, that's one way of understanding it. But I want to just suggest that another way of understanding what's going on here is that Moshe sees in God an anger that is actually something he knows from inside of himself, right? Moshe knows what it is to be vayiksof, to get frothing with rage. The Torah has never actually described God that way, described Pharaoh that way. So that's like not a sweet comparison. But Moshe knows that feeling, describes Moses that way. And then Moshe starts to talk about God, and Moshe presumes that God feels the same kind of anger that Moshe feels inside of himself. In other words, I look out into the world and I see an angry God because I am angry. And I see my anger in the angry God, right? I think it's actually it's in some ways best expressed in this last example here, where Moshe says, remember that you enraged God, you made God angry. And why? Because you have been rebels against the eternal. Now, who's saying that? Moshe's saying that you've been rebels. In fact, that was the same language that Moshe used in that third example that Rashi gave us. Moshe said, "Hear now, you rebels," and he struck the rock. In other words, Moshe is the one that thinks of these people as rebels, and he is the one that's been enraged by them, and he only just assumes that God feels the same rage that he feels. Now, God is an angry figure in the Torah, and that requires many more classes of thought and exploration, but this particular anger that Moshe sees in God, it is possible that he only sees it in God because it's a projection of something inside of himself. And if that's the case, then that truly is an act of idolatry, because he's turned his own anger into a god, right? So that might be a way of understanding that classic rabbinic statement that one who lets go into their anger, ki'ilu, it's as if they've oved avodah zarah, they've served idolatry. Okay, so it's a little tour through frothing rage in the Torah. I will see you next week. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. We finished now the book of Numbers, and next week we begin the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. See you next week, everybody.